The 1960s and 70s was a rough transitional period for the US. The setting was in America where citizens began seeking social justice and reform. America was in conflict with Russia and Vietnam in order to fight communism, and outraged citizens were beginning to seek justice for at-home affairs. One particular movement started from a small Californian farming town. In Delano, California, farm workers united and began fighting for their American dream. The fight for better working conditions from the UFW was a vital one, as it made it more possible for labor unions to form and fight similar injustices. But at the time, these injustices created a division and conflict between farm workers, landowners, and city officials.
We want the Sheriff's Department investigated. We want to know why the sheriff refuses to go into the fields and take the arms away from those men. We also want to know why the sheriff is making a special point of
This
these
is Cesar Chavez.
these raids and these beatings on our picket lines.
He is speaking during the peak of the movement, at a point where there was violence between strikers and officials. Before that point, however, he and Dolores Huerta helped form the National Farm Workers Association. Larry Seven Fingers Itilong was the leader of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, which merged into the United Farm Workers Association. The AWOC came first and consisted mainly of Filipino immigrant farm workers. The NFWA consisted mainly of Hispanic farm workers, and it formed later on. They merged together and eventually formed the UFW, or the United Farm Workers Association. But what had brought these workers to come together? The Bracero program was put into place in 1942 and gave immigrants jobs in America as farm workers. The agreement had promised fair pay and good housing. Working conditions were, however, deemed poor by the workers. When the program was put to an end in 1964 by the federal government, these unions came together and began their fight, that of which is one of the most impactful of all time. At the time, farm workers began feeling infuriated and were actually waiting for a reason to form these labor unions and strike. Once they had finally come together, they had been led to leave their work and begin protesting for better pay and better working conditions. Growers, however, saw the situation as unjust, and they did not see a point in paying these workers more due to their own personal profits, and quite frankly seeing the movement as superfluous. The conflict had eventually escalated to striking and a nationwide boycott of grapes. Workers began leaving their jobs and protesting non-violently. There were marches and protests. The civil rights movement had been taking place simultaneously, and there had been an influence on the farm workers movement. Martin Luther King Jr.'s talks of nonviolence was also a staple in the UFW movement. It almost became a code to their own personal movement.
That there's a great deal of difference between non-resistance to evil and non-violent resistance. Non-resistance leaves you in a state of stagnant passivity and deadened complacency.
This difference and duality between nonviolence and non-resistant that Dr. King was speaking on had brought much attention to these workers' movement. There was discussion on both sides. Was nonviolence just a waste of time? You'd think that this would avoid negative publicity from opposers, but quite the contrary. Despite peaceful protests, there were still negative responses in the community. The marches and protests were seen as disruptive. Those who did not agree would actually pelt rocks at protesters, and law enforcement did not take too kindly to the described disruption. The fight for better working conditions had become a full-fledged war. In In the conflict, one side was clearly the striking farm workers and their supporters. Though the opposing side was primarily growers who did not want to compromise, the true opposition from the workers was pretty much everyone else. This meant the police, growers, those who purchased grapes, and even President Richard Nixon. Both sides took drastic approaches to what they viewed as correct, but their reasons for their actions were met with internal and external conflict on both sides. The Bracero program had brought in many Mexican immigrants and their families. Filipinos had immigrated as well. Both had been seeking better lives from their individual countries. Due to the lack of people willing to work in farms in the US, the immigrants took the jobs that pretty much no one else wanted. These jobs, however, were very punishing in the long run. Little sanitation or medical assistance led to unhealthy working conditions. Long working days had been very punishing. Children had been working with their parents and ditching school in order to make enough money just to survive. Though these conditions seem tough and the idea pops up that, well, these strikers had nothing to lose, they had literally left their former lives behind to pursue an American dream and better lives for their children. Despite this, the strikes followed through. The nonviolence did not always stick. Many people who disagreed with the workers would often pelt rocks at strikers, and at a point, enough was enough and violence pursued. The cruel punishment for their free right to protest was seen as unjust by these workers. They had seen their liberties stripped at work and away from. Those that supported agreed that these workers deserved more, and from Delano, California to throughout the country, people stopped purchasing grapes from growers who were not willing to compromise with the UFW. These men have chosen this type of work like farming. They have chosen this way of life, and if they were not happy, they wouldn't be here. Jack Pandol. This was the mindset that many growers and landowners had towards the movement. Being someone on the corporate side of the farming industry was completely different from being on the working side. These growers had given these farm workers, many of them undocumented citizens, an opportunity at a life in the US. Many other lines of work would refuse to hire these people, but the Bracero program had pretty much invited them to do this line of work. When the strikes and protests had begun, there was a shortage in grape production. There were many complaints of disruptions and the grape industry had gone down. The way the growers had seen it, these workers were biting the hands that fed them. And bite they did. The shortage of grape purchases due to the boycott forced growers to compromise and coordinate with the labor union. This is one of the most important acts of compromise in US history, because the growers had won. At a time of constant national protest in the US, the UFW showed that local social justice can exist and still matter. The power of labor unions was highlighted in this act, and it showed that hard work mattered. The UFW movement is one of the most influential of all time, and to this day it shows and empowers local organizations and unions, a model to stand by, and that power can be given back to the people. Viva la causa.